On a late summer afternoon, a ledger opened on a rough plank table, and a single sentence rearranged a life. The camera of memory lingers on the small things. The smell of drying cornmeal, the grit under the soles of bare feet, the brass glint of a token that had once been part of a child's necklace. Amina stands with her palms cupped against the earth. Across from her, Master Henry's fingers rest on the margin where ink still glistens. The scribe flips a slow, decisive page. A short line of handwriting, boxed in the ledger's column, reads like a bill, but it is billing a human history. This was the exchange, a bureaucratic cruelty that didn't need chains to break a person. It only needed a pen. What that line did, and what the rest of that ledger would do again and again across dozens of similar pages, is the subject of this investigation. Not merely that people were forced to work, but that household bookkeeping, church language, and a routine called the exchange converted intimacy, family ties, motherhood, affection, into entries on a page. The exchange did not always require ropes or public spectacle. It required a column, a signature, a minister's formula. It required a community willing to let paperwork erase persons. To understand how that happened, begin with the house itself. The household was a small institution, not simply a family, but a system composed of roles, ledgers, and ritual. Master Henry presided over a pantry, a ledger, and a parish pew. Scribe Thomas kept the running account of every arrival and departure, every debt paid, every dedication made in the minister's folder. Pastor Jonas supplied the moral language, blessings, condemnations, dedications, that made transactions legible to neighbors and magistrates. Caleb, the overseer, enforced the rules on the gravel of the yard and in the hush of the night watch. Ledgers were the household's law. Margins, where a pen paused to note an incident, became the place where a woman's status was decided. A line could record a debt settled. Mill account cleared for infant, transferred to household. Another could note a token given. Brass token in lieu of payment. Recipient noted. A short phrase later researchers would find recurs like an institutional incantation. Corrective assignment. A ledger entry indicates this phrase beside names that had once been attached to kinship, mother, aunt, sister, and that phrase signaled a reclassification of rights. These entries did not float in a vacuum. The scribe's hand used parish forms. The minister's register contained an adjacent notation, a dedication or a moral comment, that made the economic line into a moral one. In a parish folder preserved in the county vaults, an annotation couples the minister's language with a transfer. Dedicated by parish to household sits beside the transaction. Dr. Lewis, who has spent years tracing marginalia across these vaults, points out how the alliance of religious language and accounts made the household's claims seem righteous. Professor Andrews argues that laundered piety often supplied the necessary plausibility for neighbors and clerks to accept the exchange as governing fact. If this sounds abstract, consider a concrete pattern repeated across the files. A mill falls behind in payment. A newborn is taken in as recompense. A brass token, small, easily described, hard to value, appears in an inventory. A minister writes a sentence that frames the infant as placed under care, and the scribe records a transfer. Over time, the child becomes listed among household labor in the ledger's labor column, then among the property inventory when an estate is counted. The exchange migrates from an ad hoc solution to a rule. The household reserves the right to reassign women on ledger authority. A short note about sources and method. What follows blends archival evidence and careful reconstruction. Records suggest this sequence. Ledger lines, marginalia, petitions, and witness depositions provide the scaffolding. Where specific dialogue appears, it is reconstructed from those materials and is indicated as such in production annotations. The intent is to illuminate, not to invent. Amina's life winds through these mechanisms. She was the child at the center of that first scene, taken into Master Henry's household after a debt was described in a mill account, recorded by Scribe Thomas as received for settlement. Her mother, Lena, whose name survives in a single petition smudged by water, appears in a line of marginalia that suggests a temporary placement. Care until able, the note reads, but the paperwork hardened. Titles changed. Where Lena had been named as mother in a baptismal entry, the ledger later lists a dependent beside Amina's name. Mateo, Amina's father in the sparse oral traces that circulate in later testimony, is listed only as an auxiliary on a shipment manifest. His name becomes sepia and thin compared to the ledger's black ink. Amina's childhood is a map of small thefts. She learned to read from letters hidden in the seam of a mattress, taught by Lucia, who doubled as a roommate and an informal teacher. In the late light by the river, she would practice shapes of letters, tasting the metallic residue of fear on her tongue, when overhearing a passing remark about debts being settled by household means. She pulled strawberries for Mistress Evelyn in the kitchen, traded jokes with Rosa the cook, and whispered a secret turn of the page to Daniel, a field hand who would later be accused of improper familiarity. Daniel and Amina learned to measure time in stolen moments, a shared slice of bread, a book furtively passed, a hand pressed into another's palm behind a barn door. That intimacies could become legal evidence was not yet apparent in her childhood. The ledger's logic was slow and cumulative. Amina's romance with Daniel, simple and ordinary, becomes the pretext for accusation. The household's record of the episode appears not as a romantic testimony but as an economy. A ledger entry notes an incident. Pastor Jonas makes a moral addendum, and the scribe brackets the names. An inspector's terse line later in a separate set of pages uses the phrase moral misstep, and a corrective assignment follows. In other files, similar patterns repeat. An intimate act is converted into a reason for transfer. The logic is bureaucratic. The household requires order. Intimacy, recategorized as disorder, is corrected by reassigning the women involved to other domestic roles or to other households altogether. The tribunal that follows Amina's accusation is one of the moments where the ledger's violence becomes visible, even without a single raised hand. The following sequence is reconstructed from depositions, marginal notes, and the minister's folder. The reconstruction aims to be faithful to the sources while acknowledging the gaps. Reconstructed scene. A long room, wooden benches worn by knees and prayer. Pastor Jonas sits near the front, the minister's register open on his lap. Master Henry stands with his coat clasped. Caleb watches the doorway. Scribe Thomas reads aloud from a stitched booklet, his voice steady. Incident recorded on the third entry. Witness statements appended. Rosa and Maribel, household women whose own positions make them both observers and participants, give testimony that, in later accounts, appears conflicted. Some words of sympathy, some of compulsion. The minister intones a phrase that will later appear in ledger marginalia, for correction and order. Amina hears her name in a voice that feels like a ledger. The renaming ceremony follows as a formal administrative act more than a private moment. Where once the community used a given name to summon a person, the household now uses a phrase that indicates status. The scribe writes a terse line that will have consequences. Amina, reassigned, corrective assignment, visitation restricted. The phrase performs the erasure it names. It severs the invisible threads of kinship, who may visit, what exchanges are permitted, and replaces them with columns and check marks. A single sentence in a book now stands between a mother and her child, between lovers who might have fled together, between siblings who might have clung to one another. After the tribunal, a litany of daily changes descend. Rations shift. Where Amina once ate at the common table, she is now counted against quota lines and served in a separate place. Inspector notes, often disguised in neutral language, record adjusted allotment and differential bedding. The ledger frames these as managerial choices, but the lived consequence is a relegation of touch and speech. Letters are monitored, correspondence censored or destroyed. A note found sewn into a cuff, an item later unearthed by an archivist, contains a few preserved lines. If you read this, remember, tea at dusk, the third stone. Small acts of memory survive, where official records sought to obliterate them. Surveillance becomes the routine of the reclassified. Caleb's nightly inspections, detailed in a ledger of household rounds, note Amina's movements by shorthand. Different soaps, different linens, different beds mark status. These are not simply symbolic. They operate as a system of enforcement. A sullen glance, spoken admonition, or a withheld privilege is recorded. Inspector Marginalia reads, exemplary correction material, to be moved upon exhaustion. The language is clinical, designed to naturalize the transfer. The transfer itself is not sold as violence. It is administered as an administrative necessity. Resistance threads through this system in small but significant ways. It appears as petitions stapled to the minister's folder, hand-scrawled pleas from Rosa, Maribel, and Lucia, asking for reconsideration, stamped in purple, refused. Those petitions, stamped and returned, do not tell the whole story. Hidden letters were found later beneath hearthstones and inside the hems of aprons. One letter, discovered by Amelia in a water-damaged trunk, reads in part, "We do not forget names, we give them to the light." Another fragment, transcribed by Professor Andrews, indicates clandestine schooling. We teach the children to write their true names. Sabotage is less dramatic than one expects. Grain milled to be bitter, a pot slightly salted, a set of linens locked in a chest and discovered damp. These acts slowed the household machinery and kept memory alive. Lena, a name that appears in a margin, kept a list of births and given names sewn into the seam of her apron. When officials later counted the household's assets, these hidden lists surfaced like ghosts. The archival record that scholars consult to piece together this pattern is itself a site of violence and repair. Pages have been deliberately trimmed, water has eaten ink, bindings were restitched by hands that perhaps sought to conceal as much as to preserve. Amelia found a ledger with its first and last leaves missing, the central portion stitched back together with a coarse thread. The edges of one page bore the faint line of scissors. Dr. Lewis describes how such trimming functioned as a slow erasure. Where they could not destroy a name, they removed the context that authenticated it. Marginalia survive in unexpected places, on a receipt folded inside a hymnal, in a minister's prayer book, in the back of a shipping manifest. Historians reconstruct fragments with patience. Professor Andrews cross-referenced marginal notes with shipping lists, while Amelia used multispectral imaging to read words obscured by age. Dr. Lewis compared handwriting samples and catalogued recurring formulas. Phrases like corrective assignment and transferred for care that keep appearing beside women's names across disparate ledgers. These patterns indicate a rule, not isolated incidents. A household practice replicated until it became an expectation of governance. The exchange's reach extended beyond the immediate moment of a tribunal. Descendants, generations later, encounter genealogical blanks and shredded threads. A family tree fissured where a name should be can be the legacy of a ledger's decision. Letters from those descendants, opened by contemporary archivists, reveal stories of absence, mothers who vanish from records, children who show up as dependents in another household's inventory. In one file, a shipment manifest lists children accounted for, under a different household name. A later petition questions the absence of birth registers. The ledger made absence look like a logistical error, not an injustice. The erasure was bureaucratic and therefore harder to contest. In the institutional attempt to hide this rule, the method mattered as much as the motive. When records were altered, it was rarely done to draw attention. Pages were trimmed, not shredded. Notes were lightened, not blotted out. A ledger might be water damaged in one corner, as if an accident had occurred. The combination of accidents and careful editing created reasonable doubt for future readers. But patterns remain. Across repeated cases, the same combination appears. Moral language from the pastor, a ledger entry reassigning a woman, a token noted in an inventory, a petition stamped and refused. That repeated logic is what Dr. Lewis, Professor Andrews, and Amelia cite as evidence of a deliberate system. Records suggest a recipe for converting intimacy into property. Yet the ledger did not entirely succeed in making people vanish. Names survive in knitted cuffs, in clandestine letters, in the voices of those who testified in marginal depositions. Rosa's testimony, while complicated by her own constrained position, includes details of a secret meeting where several women shared names and births to preserve genealogical memory. These everyday resistances preserved human identities against the ledger's flattening tendencies. The sewn cuff, later displayed in an archive, is a small, stubborn protest. Stitched in a margin is the word "remember" beneath a line of initials. The moral architecture of the exchange was as important as its practice. Religious phrases rendered transfers legitimate in the eyes of neighbors. Legal terminologies alchemized into managerial necessities. Placement for reformation reads a minister's note. Maintained under household custody reads a ledger line. The alliance between ministry and accountancy gave shape to the practice. But the chapel did not produce the ledger's violence alone. It offered rhetorical cover. The cruelty of the exchange is that it relied on the ordinary authority structures of a community to naturalize its operations. Consider the long-term consequences that do not fit neatly into a ledger column. Genealogical erasure is one. Children whose maternal names are crossed out become hard to track. Descendants looking for origins find gaps where intimacy once was. The administrative half-measures, occasional returns, partial awards, or formal apologies in later years rarely make whole the lives that were reclassified. Institutional cover-up and later attempts at administrative justice both leave traces. A return token here, a clerk's note of regret there. Yet the ledger's initial act, The exchange left a structural wound. The very ubiquity of ledger language is an indictment. When the same phrase recurs in seemingly unrelated households, when Pastor Jonas's formula appears beside transfers in other ministers' registers, and when inspectors' shorthand cites corrective assignment as a routine remedy, an institutional logic is revealed. The exchange becomes not an ad hoc response, but a policy in practice. Historians interpret the repetition as evidence. When small acts align on paper again and again, pattern replaces coincidence. What does this mean for how we remember? It demands that we treat archival paper as living testimony and that we listen for the human sounds underneath the ink. Names matter. A single preserved name can resist the ledger's authority. A hidden list sewn into an apron, a rejected petition kept and copied by a friend, a child's carved initial on a beam. These are the forms of counter-archival survival. Amelia, cataloging one trunk, cried when she found a folded page listing births with the word Lena repeated. The repeated act of naming as resistance. We must also be cautious about the limits of our evidence. The files are fragmentary. Where documents are missing, statements are careful. Records suggest, a ledger entry indicates, the minister's register records what it records. We do not assert legal verdicts beyond what the documents support. We do not reconstruct whole lives from single lines. But the pattern is clear enough. A practice called the exchange, administered through ledgers and ministerial language, had the effect of reassigning women across households and erasing their relational claims. The human detail is essential to maintain dignity. Amina liked the color of the river in early spring, when mud turned silver, and the light made threads of hair look like spun metal. She kept one brass ring hidden in a hollow of a fence post. Daniel whistled off-key when nervous. Rosa named the pots in the kitchen, and Maribel had a small bundle of embroidered scraps she carried like a secret Bible. These details are not theatrical flourishes. They are the persistent facts of personhood amid the regimen of classification. They remind us that the exchange settled not just accounts, but lives that laughed, loved, and remembered. After decades of obscurity, modern historians brought the stitched and stained ledger pieces back into conversation. Amelia's multispectral scans revealed ink beneath a layer of varnish. Professor Andrews matched handwriting across 3 separate volumes. Dr. Lewis compiled a database of phrases and marginal notes. Their work makes visible what masters tried to hide, a systemic practice that depended on everyday bureaucratic procedures. The ledger's discretion was its power. A well-placed sentence could make a separation plausible to neighbors and future clerks alike. The final claim is stark and narrow. The worst rule enslaved women feared was not merely the whip or the threat of physical punishment. It was the ledger's capacity to rename and reassign them, to convert their relationships into entries, their mothers into dependents, their friends into assets. That paper rule, the exchange, did a kind of administrative violence that was slow, legalistic, and therefore harder to contest and easier to hide. There is a moral urgency to recovering these files, to preserve the names that the pages sought to erase, to highlight the methods of erasure, and to honor the small resistances that kept memory alive. If these narratives teach anything, it is that bureaucracy can be weaponized when institutions collaborate, scribes, ministers, overseers, and that the trace of that weapon persists until careful hands pry pages apart and read what remains. If you want the next file opened, subscribe. Your engagement helps send researchers back to the stacks to look for the next margin, the next sewn cuff, the next erased name. In closing, remember the ledger as both object and act. It is paper and ink, yes, but also a mechanism that turned belonging into accounted-for labor. The exchange turned intimacy into a transaction and used the language of piety and management to make that transformation appear normal. The consequence was not only short-term suffering, but long-term genealogical rupture and the quiet disappearance of people from their own lineages. Preserve the names. When you encounter a document, an old photograph, a family scrap, hold it as more than evidence. Hold it as testimony. Share this film with someone committed to archives, with someone who cares about how paperwork can hide injustice. If a single detail shocked you, start a comment with the word shock and name it. Tell us which line moved you most. That small action helps prioritize which files historians should open next. The ledger closed on its planks long ago, but the act of reading it reopens a life. Amina's name is still there in letters and hemstitches, in petitions and marginal notes, in the memory of women who refused to let the household's columns define them entirely. The exchange sought to hide by numbering and assigning. But work of recovery takes names off the page and places them back into human story. That is the work the archives and the living must do together, to uncover, to remember, and to refuse the ease of a single sterile phrase that once pretended to govern a life. Share this account. Remember a name. Keep opening ledgers.